I'm Frank Reynolds, and this is the National Presbyterian Church and Center. When Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet, made his first trip to America, he said he was dismayed to find the plane full of gnomes, international spies, and Presbyterians. Presbyterians don't mind the company of gnomes, spies, or even poets, but that's hardly the way to locate the Presbyterian faith. Where do Presbyterians come from? Some people think they're all from Scotland. The old joke asks, what did the first two Scotsmen do when they came to America? The answer, one started the first Presbyterian church, the other started the second Presbyterian church, just across the street. But would it surprise you to learn that more Presbyterians came to America from Ireland and England than from Scotland? What do Presbyterians look like? Some people regard them as middle-class capitalists with a worship so cold you could skate down the aisle. Others say the church programs remind them of a lunatic asylum on fire. In fact, neither description is accurate. To touch the uniqueness of a Presbyterian, might as well start with the theological father, John Calvin. What did he think a Presbyterian was?
Calvin was a French lawyer and an admirer of Martin Luther. If Luther was the heart of the Reformation, then Calvin was its mind. Both men were afire with the same ideas: the priesthood of all believers, the authority of the Bible, the purity of the church, and above all, justification by grace through faith. Grace means that God demands from us what only God, working through us, can achieve. Since this is the core of Christianity, the Reformers did not feel they were creating a new church, but reforming the old one. Most histories present only a toy Calvin, a tiny fragment of a towering and many-sided personality. At 27, he published the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which overnight became a think piece for Baptists, Anglicans, and Congregationalists. He was never ordained, but his academy trained great numbers of clergy from all over Europe. He was richly born and a friend of nobles, but his work hastened the rise of democracy. Here in Geneva, Calvin perfected a church government of laymen and ministers called presbyters, from the Greek word for elder. Despite criticisms, Calvin retained a lively wit. According to one story, a heckler asked him, "If you know so much, tell us what God was doing before he created the earth." Calvin replied, he was making hell for over-curious men. Thanks to Calvin, the Presbyterian Church is composed in equal parts of ardor and order. That is, ardor for things of the Spirit and order for the things of society. That's the tension of the Calvinistic life. But Calvin stood for both poles of the church, ardor and order. He symbolized ardor in his crest, the flaming heart in an open hand offered to God. His form of government stood just as firmly for order. Out of this tension came the mightiest streams of Presbyterianism. The English Puritans, who were people of ardor, the Scottish churchmen, who were people of order. Calvin passed the baton to his disciple, John Knox, under whose leadership the Church of Scotland was born. Most remember Knox for his opposition to Mary, Queen of Scots, and her Catholic court. At stake was the religious and political life of the nation. Unfortunately, Mary lost her head. Knox kept his and built the Presbyterian system right into the blood and bone of Scotland. It remains the official church today. For example, When Queen Elizabeth visits Scotland, she becomes a Presbyterian during her stay. And all Presbyterians, American, English, Welsh, German, Hungarian, Dutch, feel as though they are coming home when they visit Edinburgh.
One great event for Presbyterians was the emigration of Scotsmen to Northern Ireland. Persecuted for their faith, they poured over to Ulster by the thousands and set up strong centers of Presbyterianism. Later, these people, the so-called Scotch-Irish, came to America in huge waves, and they brought their orderly church with them.
Neither English nor Scottish were the first Presbyterians to hit the shores of America, however. That honor belonged to the French reformers often called Huguenots, who came to St. Augustine in 1562 with a Master Robin, their preacher. Robin and his parishioners might have had second thoughts about this honor because the Spanish wiped them out to a man. During that same period, 30,000 of these Calvinists were killed in the St. Bartholomew massacre. Meanwhile, in England, the Puritans, who were also Calvinists, took over the English government, beheaded the king, and called together the famous Westminster Divines. These learned gentlemen, joined by Scottish Presbyterians, produced a major standard of the church, the Westminster Confession of Faith. From the Shorter Catechism came the famous question, what is the chief end of man? Answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Through the 1600s, most Presbyterians settled heavily in the middle colonies in America, from New York to Maryland, or down south through the Great Valley of Virginia and on into the Carolinas. A famous missionary of that era was Francis McKimmey, a Scotsman born in Ireland. At one point, he was thrown in prison for preaching in New York without a license. The governor made McKimmey pay a huge fine. As a result, the colonies rallied to the Presbyterian call for religious toleration. Even the famous Mathers of New England, Increase, and Cotton found McKimmey a voice to their liking.
So did 6 other Presbyterians, who in 1706 elected McKimmey moderator of the first American Presbytery, which was held in Philadelphia. Of these 7, about half were English Puritans with their zeal for ardor. The other half were Scotch-Irish with their equal zeal for order.
By 1717, the little presbytery had grown to 4 in Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New York, and the collection of presbyteries became the first synod. This period from 1717 to 1776 was a fabulous one for both education and evangelism. The Log College of William Tennant educated able ministers, and its graduates started a tradition of building colleges side by side with churches. Its influence contributed to the forming of the institution that later became Princeton University. Today, the Presbyterian Church can look back to a host of colleges and seminaries founded by missionaries.
This great awakening was more than a revival, it was a national seizure. Leading the way was young Jonathan Edwards, one of the ablest theologians America has ever produced. He insisted that 2 things were necessary parts of conversion. 1, the affections of the heart had to be powerfully moved. And 2, the daily actions of the Christian had to be reflections of Christ. Again, ardor and order. As a result, about 1/6 of the nation was converted, and new compassion was manifested toward Indians and Negroes.
The Revolutionary War record of the Presbyterian Church was dazzling. By that time, neither New England's Congregationists nor the Scotch-Irish had much use for the crown. In fact, Presbyterian ministers were so outspoken that one member of Parliament in London spoke of the American Revolution as the Presbyterian Rebellion. The only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence and the only clerical member of the Continental Congress was the Reverend John Witherspoon, who thundered from his pulpit, "There is not a single instance in history in which civil liberties were lost and religious liberty preserved." After the war, the American government was similar to Presbyterian government. Americans rejected both a king to rule from the top and a pure democracy to rule from the bottom for a republic in between. Presbyterians rejected both bishops to rule from the top and congregations to rule from the bottom for a presbytery in between. Now let's grit our teeth, pull down the chart, and look at the 4 levels of Presbyterian church government. First, the local congregation, which is the real authority in the church. It all starts right here. Second, presbytery. The presbytery ordains clergy, reviews church activities, and so on. Third, the synod. It reviews the work of presbytery. Fourth, the General Assembly. This is something like the White House, the Supreme Court, and Congress all in one. Its pronouncements on social affairs, war, poverty, race, etc., are not binding on congregations, but carry great weight. Compared with the number of Methodists or Baptists, Presbyterians are small potatoes. But right after the American Revolution, the Presbyterian Church was one of the 4 largest and the most evenly distributed church in America. That was not to last long for 2 reasons. First, the Presbyterians, unlike the Methodists or the Baptists, were unwilling to send uneducated men to the western frontiers of Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Mississippi Valley. People were crying for a few gospel crumbs of bread, but Presbyterians in the East said, wait for the whole loaf or starve. Naturally, the settlers joined churches that gave them the gospel, with or without a seminary degree. Whole congregations of Presbyterians became Methodists, Baptists, Cumberland Presbyterians, or joined other denominations. And there were individual missionaries of extraordinary power. One was a man named Worcester, who stood by the Cherokees during their pitiful fight for their homes and their subsequent dispossession. Worcester, who translated the Bible into Sequoia and edited a Cherokee journal, was imprisoned as a troublemaker by the state of Georgia. Worcester's case went to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Marshall sent back a ruling in his favor. The governor of Georgia replied to Marshall, "If you want Worcester, come and get him." Finally freed, he went on the 1,000-mile Trail of Tears and ministered to the Cherokees in Oklahoma for the rest of his life. Like most periods in church history, the time from 1800 to 1860 was filled with noisy issues and quiet ones. The quiet ones, a working partnership with the Congregationalist Church. Things were so close for a while that the pastor of a Presbyterian and Congregationalist church could serve in each other's pulpit. They were nicknamed Presbygationalists. The benevolent empire, so called because private individuals across church lines began crusading and organizing for moral reform and against intemperance, slavery, and war. Then there were foreign missions. Up to this time, America had been a mission field itself for Europe, especially England or Scotland. Now the American Board, formed mostly with Congregationalists and Presbyterians, sent its first missionaries to India, men and women named Judson, Rice, Newell, Holt, and Hall. And the final quiet issue, home missions. Again, Congregationalists and Presbyterians led the way by starting the American Home Missionary Society, which sent money and ministers to churches all over the South and West. Paid only a pittance, missionaries like Hall and Chapman planted churches and schools in Ohio, the Indiana and Illinois territories, and throughout the Mississippi Valley. By 1835, Dr. Marcus Whitman, a New York physician, had reached Oregon, his wife and those of other missionaries being the first white women to cross the Rockies. These were the quiet issues: union, missions, education. But the noisy ones got all the attention. First, there was the split in the church between the new ways and the old ways. This time, it was ardor versus order. The leaders of the ardent wing wanted to evangelize the frontiers and change anything that got in the way of their mission. But the leaders of the orderly wing disliked the evangelical spirit because it got in the way of sound theology. They wanted to change nothing. Things got so hot, the church burst its seams. And for years, there were two Presbyterian denominations. That was bad enough. But the worst was yet to come: slavery. In 1818, the General Assembly said, "We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another totally irreconcilable with the gospel of Jesus Christ." Unfortunately, the cotton gin spoke louder than Christ, and Presbyterians said in 1836, resolved that this whole subject be indefinitely postponed. But it would not go away, and soon Presbyterians, like other Christians, were killing each other in the Civil War. The tragedy is that after the war, the nation reunited, but not the Presbyterians. From the Civil War on, we focus our attention on that branch called the Presbyterian Church in the USA, which is now the United Presbyterian Church. There were other large Presbyterian bodies, such as the descendants of Scottish Covenanters and Seceders, who merged their splendid heritages in the United Presbyterian Church of North America in 1858. Meanwhile, there was the Far West, still untamed, and gold was in the air. Back east, the United States was growing into a nation of cities overnight. At first, most Presbyterians were unsympathetic toward labor, but increasingly, the General Assembly began to take their side in the battle for wages and housing. It was here at New York's Labor Temple that Presbyterians became the helpers of the helpless. Neighborhood houses, many starting in Chicago, spread into every city. By 1900, national agencies had sprung up to combat poverty, war, and alcoholism. Meanwhile, both home and foreign missions were gathering steam. When the railroad spike of gold was pounded into the intercontinental hookup, Sheldon Jackson and his band of national missionaries spread westward, planting churches and building schools, especially schools for Indians and hospitals for all. One of the great missions was to the Chinese in California. Leading the way was a woman, Donaldina Cameron, who rescued Chinese girls from white slavers and established the Great Cameron House. Amanda McFarland served first in New Mexico, then in Alaska, where she founded what became Jackson College. In 1870, the Women's Foreign Mission Society was formed. They had a large part in sending missionaries across the world, people like Helen Reischauer, who started the first school for the deaf and dumb in Japan. From Sheldon Jackson, who finally made it to Alaska, to Ralph Hall with his early campfire meetings, to Dr. Dorothy Ferris, medical missionary to Japan, the church stayed on the mission move. Missionary Jackson became the first commissioner of education in the Alaska Territory. People who try to make audio-visual histories are especially grateful to him because he was a camera bug. Overseas, the church sent missionaries to 21 countries and areas of the world, largely in the Cameroon, Brazil, Cuba, India, Iran, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Pakistan, Syria, and the Philippines. One of the most successful missions was that of the United Presbyterian Church of North America in Egypt, which began back in the 1850s and pioneered its way into self-support. Davida Finney began the literacy and literature program in Egypt, which thrives today. Much of this came under the leadership of a layman, Dr. Robert E. Spear. Perhaps this man is the church's leading symbol of education. Before he was a politician and a president, he was a teacher at Princeton and a very gifted lay preacher. Following the Civil War, the church had begun to teach its own through Sunday school classes for children, through Christian Endeavor and later Westminster Fellowships for students, and through communicants classes for new members. Then, as always, the most striking reminder of Calvin's scholarship was the emergence of new colleges. Theologically, the church went through the battles of modernism and fundamentalism. Again, the forces of ardor favored changes in the Westminster Confession to make the gospel more appealing, while the forces of order did not wish to abandon a single jot or tittle of orthodoxy. It was a fabulous era. Much to the disgust of church capitalists, the leading socialist was Presbyterian Norman Thomas. Balancing him, however, was the silver-tongued William Jennings Bryan. From World War I to World War II, a new wave of thought hit the church. Pastors and teachers rediscovered the Bible. The leader of this new kind of orthodoxy was the great Reformed theologian and pastor, Karl Barth. Meanwhile, between the wars and despite depression, Presbyterians continued to plant churches, schools, and hospitals. The ecumenical movement surged strong and wide as Christians made common cause with all their brothers around the world. The idea was simple. You can't be a good Presbyterian, or Methodist, or Catholic locally unless you are also a good Christian internationally. From World War II till the 1970s, Presbyterians hustled into every area of national and international life. At home, the mission stretched from rural Appalachia to southwestern health and welfare units. From ministry among and with blacks in the rural South to side-by-side brotherhood with minorities in the inner cities. From hundreds of new churches in suburbia to a new program of keeping the churches alive in the ghetto. From community organizations to drug clinics and legal aids for the poor and the crippled. Some of our films from that period in the 50s show united Presbyterian concern for the have-nots.
Any old trouble.
Gripped by the imperative of Matthew 25, the General Assembly gathered a council of laymen and pastors, of theologians and social scientists, and of businessmen to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and visit the prisoners. Following World War II, the General Assembly took some strong stands. It advised the Supreme Court not to approve prayer in public schools. It recognized drugs and alcohol as symptoms of a disease to be attacked medically and with Christian understanding. But the most explosive issue for the 1960s, just as it was the most explosive issue for the 1860s, was race. And to the glory of Presbyterians, they quarreled and debated, but did not split. When this man was arrested in Baltimore,
and this man marched in Selma and witnessed on the scene in Mississippi, some cried that clergy should stay out of politics. While others, both clergy and laymen, were proud to join in the crusade. What emerged was a two-legged gospel, the right leg of personal salvation and the left leg of community correction. Again, ardor and order. Abroad, the Presbyterians continued to blaze trails. The day of sending missionaries to the heathen gave way to fraternal workers who helped various national churches establish themselves, their clergy, and their own missions. Long before the Peace Corps, Presbyterians were doing the same thing on a worldwide scale. The overriding thought was this: the world mission is one mission on 6 continents, and all of us are missionaries to one another. And that goes at home, too. In 1958, 2 great branches merged: the Presbyterian Church in the USA and the United Presbyterian Church of North America. The name adopted was the United Presbyterian Church in the USA. In education, Presbyterians hacked their way through the jungle of church school materials and produced the first graded curriculum for Protestants, one that gave the students textbooks and workbooks and learning materials, plus a high-protein diet of theology. No church can last long without its patriarchs. Here are a few of the great leaders.
Standing here before some of the great figures in Presbyterian history, we see a chest of memories inhabited by people very much like us. The little church of ardor and order made its way from Europe to America, fought a revolution, sent missions to the frontiers, split during the Civil War, was buffeted by every storm of controversy, and yet managed to survive as one thread in the rich tapestry of religion in America. At its best and at its worst, the Presbyterian tribe is the many faces of the past, its buildings, worship, and writings. But it is also the living present, where the church borrows glory and value from the living Lord to serve an aching world.